In these last two lectures, we're going to take a look at punctuation. Punctuation are those little marks, those non-verbal marks that help us navigate meaning in a sentence. Okay, they help clarify meaning. And to get an idea of how valuable punctuation is, take a look at the above samples up here. Okay, and the first one is not punctuated, and it doesn't seem to make much sense. It reads something like, James, while John had a better effect on the teacher. Okay, I've no idea what that means. But if you look at it punctuated, that is with commas and quotes and even a semicolon put in, the sentence starts to make sense. So, James, while John had, full stop, had a better effect on the teacher. Okay, so evidently now we're talking about a some sort of writing exam, either an essay or an answer in a quiz or an exercise, and the form had, that is the past perfect form of had a better effect on the teacher. Okay, James received a better grade. See, but it's the punctuation that makes the difference, and this is what we're going to be looking at. The period is the most used punctuation in English, and it indicates the end of a sentence. That is, when we come to the period, the sentence is done. Except for a couple instances, and I'll get to that very shortly, but we see a couple of examples over here. You should not go there, period. That's a good question, period. Very often said when the speaker wishes that you hadn't asked the question, but that's another matter. It's also used after abbreviations, and I have a couple of abbreviations here that show how it's used, etc., Mr., Reverend, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Mr. Smith, and etc., etc., for etc., period. It's also used in numbers to indicate a decimal point. So 1.5 million light years, for instance. You see the period being used between the 1 and the 5. So this is the period. But for the most part, it's used to indicate the completion of a sentence. And that's the primary function in writing. The next item we'll come to is the semicolon. And I guess it's logical to put it here because its main function in English is as what you might call a junior period. Think of it as a junior period. That's its main function. I would call it that because it separates completely independent clauses and yet keeps them in the same sentence. And so I give you a couple of examples here. The boy hit the ball, semicolon, he ran to first base. That could just as easily be written with a period. The boy hit the ball, period, he ran to first base. See, so the semicolon functions the same as a period in this way. And another example that I have, we waited outside the mall for 7 hours in the freezing snow, semicolon. The widescreen TVs were sold out by the time we got in. So you see you have two independent clauses with no conjunction in between. And as we learned earlier, you can't separate those with a comma, and you certainly can't just leave nothing in between them, but you could put a period there, or you could put a semicolon. So in that sense, the semicolon functions as a junior period. Now I put this word of warning because I often see this mistake in student writing. Students use the semicolon as kind of a comma, and that's incorrect in this sense. So take a look at the example that I have over here. The boy hit the ball, semicolon, and he ran to first base. You see that those are two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction but you have a semicolon. Now we know from the previous slide that we can just leave out the and just put the two independent clauses together in the same sentence, separated by a semicolon. But you cannot use the semicolon and a conjunction. Think of the semicolon in this sense as a kind of conjunction. And so just like you wouldn't say and he ran to first base, you wouldn't say semicolon and he ran to first base. And the correct way to punctuate it would either be with just a semicolon, with no and, perhaps a comma and the and, or a period and no conjunction whatsoever. Another incorrect form that I mark down here is if the rain stops, semicolon will go out. So you see we have the subordinate clause, if the rain stops, and then a kind of a full stop, a kind of, that not kind of, but the junior period. Remember, the semicolon is a junior period. If the rain stops, stop, will go out. You can't do that. You have to have the comma there. If the rain stops, comma will go out. So just a couple of examples of how not to use the semicolon as a comma. However, with that said, you can use the semicolon as a kind of super comma, and I'll explain how that is. The rule is that if you have interior commas that form a couple of different functions and would cause confusion used only as commas, then you can use the semicolon in the place of the commas, or one set of the commas. So perhaps it'd be better if I actually show you an example. So read the first one, the first incorrect sample over here. On our trip, we stayed at the Hyatt, Atlanta, Georgia, the Meridian, New York, the Ritz-Carlton, London, England, the Holiday Inn, Honolulu, Hawaii, the Hampton Inn, Las Vegas, Nevada. So you see how the commas don't really tell us where to stop, and I've got everything mixed up. But look at the example with the actual semicolons put in, and you'll see that we have one flowing sentence, one sentence, and we have both commas properly used and semicolons to set off larger divisions, not a major division, not a full stop, but another kind of division. So let me read that one. I'm going to read the correct version now. On our trip, comma, we stayed at the Hyatt, comma, Atlanta, Georgia, semicolon. The Meridian, New York, semicolon. The Ritz-Carlton, London, England, semicolon. The Holiday Inn, Honolulu, Hawaii, semicolon. The Hampton Inn, Las Vegas, Nevada. Okay, so you got that. So if you have interior commas used in a couple different ways, and usually some sort of long list, that would be confusing if you just use the commas. You can use the semicolon as a kind of super comma. So we have two different uses for the semicolon, and I think it's easy to remember, or at least it's easy for me to communicate, and it might be easier for you to remember if you think of the semicolon fulfilling the role of either a junior period or a super comma. The colon are those two little marks, one above the other, sort of like a period with a dot above it. And this sets up something that follows. Sometimes it's a list, as in the example that I have here. For this week's construction project, we need the following equipment: a backhoe, a forklift, a bulldozer, and a skip loader. Okay, so now actually I have no idea what they're going to do with all that stuff. I'm not a construction type of guy, but that's what they need, okay, because I have the list there following the colon. Now, the colon can also set up a full sentence, something like a semicolon does, but it works differently because the statement has been set up by the colon and it directly follows. So something like, in reviewing your loan packet, I noticed the following is missing. You did not include the $100 application fee. Okay, so the colon sets up what follows. That's the function of the colon. Slightly different from the semicolon. Let me give you a couple more examples of the colon in use. So one example is in a positive. That is something like a hyphen. It sets up something opposite the first statement. Bob could not speak, colon. He was drunk. So you see, so the colon establishes that what's going to happen next is an explanation of the first statement. It could be a title. Very often academic papers are punctuated like this. Darth Vader versus Superman. colon. Aggression and intimacy in two pre-adolescent boys groups. Okay, so the colon further explains the first part of the title. Lastly, you could have an introduction of speech. And so instead of saying he said, you would have something like Benjamin Franklin proclaimed the virtue of frugality, that is saving money. Quote, a penny saved is a penny earned, unquote. You see, so the colon sets up a speech or a quote. Or just Hamlet, colon. There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And that's the quote that is set up by the colon. So these are some other functions of the colon. A quick note about other colon use. You could use it in something like a biblical citation, John 3:16, John 3:16. It's used obviously enough in time. The plane arrives at 10:15, 10:15 equals the 10th hour and the 15th minute, right? And in formal communication, formal written communication, mostly in the form of letters. Very often we don't employ it in emails. Those are kind of a different format, but something like to whom it may concern, very formal, vague address with a colon, or dear Mr. Smith, a colon. You wouldn't write a colon if you're writing a letter to your grandma, dear grandma, colon. That would look weird. You'd probably use a comma there, but in formal correspondence you would use a colon. We have a few different uses for the hyphen. That's that dash, that single dash. And we see from the examples that you use, one of the areas that you use the hyphen is where you have two words that form a single modifier, as if the two words were a single adjective, such as in the example, a one-way street. You notice how one-way is really one idea. It's essentially one word or word, okay? I've reverted to the irritating air quotes. Anyway, chocolate-covered peanuts. Okay, so the chocolate-covered is a single adjective that modifies peanuts, and so we create a single word with the hyphen. And a well-known author. That well-known is a single idea that's modifying author. Now notice that these compound modifiers are not hyphenated if they are what's called predicates. Broadway only goes one way, or goes only one way, sorry. Broadway goes only one way. No hyphen. The peanuts were chocolate covered. No hyphen. The author was well known. No hyphen. So if the two-word phrase is being used as a modifier for a noun, that is, if it comes before the noun, then you use the hyphen. But if it comes after the verb, as in the author was well known, there's no hyphen. Okay, so in the next couple slides, we'll take a look at some other uses for the hyphen. There's a few other places that we use a hyphen. We use them in compound numbers such as 46 or 63. That's when we're writing the numbers out in letters. We're spelling the words out. We're spelling the number words out. You use them in prefixes such as ex-husband, self-assured, mid-September. So you could use the hyphen in that case. And in what's called phrasal nouns, so such as brother-in-law or attorney at law. You see, so the brother-in-law and attorney at law and stepfather, they're actually one word, and we're forming a compound word, and we're joining the compounds together with hyphens. There's one other place that you'd use a hyphen, and that's to avoid confusion or to avoid an awkward combination of letters. So, for instance, if you wanted to re-sign a petition, that is, sign a petition again, you see, you would use the hyphen. This would be different from to resign from a job. So notice the spelling, the letters are exactly the same, but we distinguish between the two by using a hyphen in the first case, to re-sign the petition. And the re, in this case, would be a prefix, wouldn't it? you would say, or you would write semi-independent, because the I in the semi would run into the I in the independent, and you have two I's, and that would be very awkward, and so you would have the semi-independent, but using the same prefix, you would write semi-conscious. Now, a variation of this is the word cooperate. Sometimes the word cooperate is spelled with a hyphen, and sometimes it's spelled without. So you see, so the rule isn't absolute, but it's a good rule of thumb. And another letter confusion combination might be in a word like shell-like. You see how we have the two L's in shell and then the one L in like, and so they run together and they confuse the I, and so the hyphen becomes very helpful in reading this compound word. So this is another area in which we'd use the hyphen. The question mark might be self-explanatory. It marks a question. Okay. It comes after a direct question. He asked, quote, okay, is this the way to Tipperary? That's what he actually said. Is this the way to Tipperary? And even in our intonation, we lift our voices. Most of the times we lift our voices. Is this the way to Tipperary? Okay, when we ask a question. And it also marks questions that are not in quotation marks, such as in the sentence that we have over here, the example sentence. One question remains for humanity. Will we ever know a planet without war? Okay, will we ever know a planet without war? So that's a question, okay, albeit perhaps a rhetorical question. That is a question that does not require an answer, is not looking for an answer, but actually in a way makes a statement, but nevertheless a question, and is marked with a question mark at the end of it. But the question is not used after a direct and indirect quote, such as he asked, is this the way to Tipperary? He asked whether this is the way to Tipperary. He asked if this is the way to Tipperary. You see, that's an indirect quote. That's not the exact words of the person. Is actually making a statement about the question that he asked. So the question mark is not used after this type of indirect question or indirect quote. And there's one other note that you might make about the question mark is that it doesn't always end the sentence, such as the period does. If, for instance, you have a rephrasing of the first item, is this the way to Tipperary? He asked. The he asked would remain inside that sentence. You see, so and as I illustrate right here, you wouldn't begin a new sentence that he asked. That attribution of the question or the quote would still be part of the sentence. The exclamation point, which is the straight line with the dot under it, or maybe the period under it, is used after an interjection or an exclamation, as its name implies, or some sort of dramatic statement. So we have a couple of examples over here. Ouch! Stop that! The lion roared! And so all these are exclamations or dramatic statements. Note that, like the question, it doesn't necessarily end the sentence. So if I use it in a quote, such as "Stop that!" he screamed, the he screamed would be part of this sentence that contains the quote "Stop that." So, but it can end the sentence. It is a final punctuation point if need be. The quotation mark or marks are used to indicate a number of different things. The first being a quote, a quotation. That is when you are repeating something that somebody said, or perhaps you're writing a story and you're giving dialogue of what one of the characters said or purportedly said. So, so indirect quotes, as it indicates over here, Confucius said, "Everything has beauty, but not everyone sees it." Okay, so we put the exact words of the person in quotes. And note that in American English, the period goes inside the quotes. In British English, the period would go outside the quotes. Okay, so it's also used to mark titles of short stories, articles, journal, magazine, newspaper articles, and poems. So William Faulkner's short story "Rose for Emily" would be put inside quotes. John Keats' "Ode to a Nightingale" would be put inside quotes. It's the title of a poem. And the title of a newspaper, "Rosemount High makes the playoffs." Okay, so that's a newspaper article, the sports paper pages of the newspaper. And then sometimes you would mark slang or colloquial language with quotes when you're using that slang word or the colloquial language. And colloquial, of course, refers to everyday speech, but not formal. But you're using that in a piece of formal writing. So you do not use slang or colloquial language in formal writing, except if you put it in quotes. And so, so if you're writing some sort of essay for for school, and you write something like, "He said the movie was, quote, the bomb." Okay, and the bomb would be slang term, not formal. Okay. And it's not literally a bomb, okay? It's you're using it as a slang term, and the bomb means something special, and you're marking that specialness with the quotes. The word parentheses comes from a word from the Greek that means to place alongside. And this is what it does. It allows us to place explanatory material, or an aside, that is a digression from the main point, inside a sentence. And I've listed over here a few of the most commonly used examples in which this happens. So first, we might consider the aside, something that's not in the main course of the discourse, but adds to it in one way or another. So so we can read the first item. "He blamed me for what happened that long, hot night in August, although it wasn't all my fault." You see, so that "although it wasn't all my fault" offers some sort of digression or explanation to the main statement. Another way that the parentheses can be used is to offer a definition or explanation of an item. So Winston Churchill was occasionally beset by what he called his black dog, a very deep depression. So, in parentheses, we have a very deep depression. It offers a definition of the black dog. Okay, so so that's another way that the parentheses can be used. And another way is in numbered items. If you just have a list and you want to number items, you use parentheses to set off the numbers. And so we see the example over here. There are 2 reasons your plan will not work. Number 1, or 1 in parentheses, it's prohibitive cost. 2 in parentheses, the opposition from stakeholders. Okay, so it just serves to help enumerate items in a list sometimes. We also use the parentheses to introduce acronyms or abbreviations. And this is a useful tool in formal writing because very often what you do is you give the whole name of an organization, for instance, and then you put in parentheses the abbreviation that you'll use throughout the rest of the paper. And so we have an example here. The data collected by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, parentheses, FBI. So from now on, I'm going to refer to this as the FBI, for its crime reports is considered to be accurate. So, so now, even though you know what the FBI is, and I just use this for an example. Okay, and citations. So if you're doing a research paper, there are certain types of styles, certain styles that use what's called parenthetical citations, in text parenthetical citation. We see an example here. This would be an example from an MLA style paper. So you have a quote. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And then you have the closed quote, so that's the quoted material. And then where did that come from? Well, we have that information given in the parentheses, between the two parentheses. And in this case, it'd be Tolstoy, page 4. Okay, so anyway, so those are some of the uses of the parentheses, which places material alongside of the main material, which places supplementary material alongside the main material in a body of text. Another use for quotes is what we call the scare quotes. And here I have a picture of one of the most frightening things I can think of, a clown. Okay, so the scare quotes refer to when you're using a word not in its normal meaning. Okay, so already I'm trying to shift the meaning of the word. The meaning that you imply is sometimes unconventional, ironic, or even the opposite of the denotation of the word, the dictionary definition of the word. And a couple examples that we have here are something like, it's a hangout for the very rich. Only the best people go there. You see, so even in speech, I'd kind of overemphasize the word, and so I don't really mean that they're the best people. They're the best people. They think that they're the best, or they're the best by virtue of their money, but nothing else. Okay. Another thing, you might have heard your grandpa say something like, I don't understand the music these kids listen to nowadays. So, when grandpa says music, he doesn't really mean that he considers it music. It's just noise. It's not music, So anyway, but that's an example of scare quotes when you're using a word to mean something other than its normal meaning or its dictionary definition meaning. And sometimes you're even using it to mean the opposite of its dictionary definition. Sometimes people use scare quotes mistakenly or in a wrong manner, and you can't even quite figure out what it is that they mean, because remember, the scare quotes are supposed to indicate a meaning that's opposite of what the word might really indicate. So, so if you see something like, please do not use staples for posting on the bulletin board, you go, so does that mean you want me to use staples? Or cheeseburgers and fries? It's not really a cheeseburger, it's something else. Enjoy. Okay. So you don't really want me to enjoy it, huh? Or don't play with fire. So I should play with fire? Or we will be closed on Christmas, so the so-called Christmas, you call it Christmas, but it's really something else. And, just totally confusing. And you see a lot of this. Sometimes people make signs, and such as this one example that I found on the internet. Fumigation, our prices. So they're not really your prices and not really our prices. They're somebody else's prices. We will not be undersold. Not. So that means you will be undersold. Because not, if you put not in quotes like that, it means that it has some other meaning. Or free photo termite inspection. So it's not really a photo inspection. You're just calling it a photo inspection, or you're using the term photo ironically. And you see, it's totally confusing to anybody who's literate, that is. So use scare quotes correctly, and don't use them just randomly. You do not use quotation marks to emphasize some things. Okay? So be careful. Or I should say, be careful. So the last item of punctuation that I'll discuss in this particular lecture, we have one more lecture on punctuation, but the last one I will discuss here and now will be what's called the ellipsis. Okay, and the ellipses are those three little dots that you see from time to time, and they mean a couple different things. One is if you're writing a story, you might have somebody say, and the murderer was ... So it might indicate a a trailing off, the end of a speech. Maybe that's the time that the detective is shot or something like that, or there's a shot in another room of the mansion. Okay, and everybody goes running off before the person who done it can be revealed. Another way that the ellipsis is used is when you are quoting something exactly, but you don't want to quote all the words. So you leave a gap between the one part of the quote and the other part, and that's in that can be seen in the example that I have here. The quote, "It was the best of times, the worst of times." And so I've left something out there. Now, you have to be careful not to change the meaning of the phrase. And so, for instance, if you're quoting former President Richard Nixon, who was driven from office for various forms of malfeasance, and he once said famously, "I am not a crook." "I'm not a crook," something like that. If you quoted that and wrote, "I'm ... a crook," well, you might be literally accurate, but you would be incorrect as far as the quote goes, because you've changed the meaning of what the person said. And one other way that the ellipsis might be used is in the form of what's called a pregnant pause. So this is an attempt to replicate a rhythm of speech. And so you might have a Dracula character or a vampire character say something like, "I never drink wine." You see, so if I said that correctly, I don't know, but you have the ... to indicate sinisterly that he might be thinking he does drink blood, but he never drinks wine. You see, so something like that. Anyway, so those are how the ellipsis is used. So remember, punctuation is something like the musical notation that helps us give meaning to the sentence, because sometimes the words by themselves do not convey meaning or don't convey unambiguous meaning, such as in the example that we have above here, "Woman without her man is nothing." Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it can mean a number of different things, and I have two examples here, and it's the punctuation that clarifies exactly what meaning is meant. So the first one, "Woman without her man is nothing." In other words, woman is nothing without a man attached to her. Okay, so you see, but it's the punctuation, the commas that frame off the "without her man" as a prepositional phrase. We should recognize that now as a prepositional phrase that gives meaning to that sentence. However, if we wrote it, "Woman without her man is nothing," and that's the second example. So that's woman, without her man is nothing. So a man is nothing without a woman. So you see, two entirely different meanings. And it's the punctuation that gives those sentences meanings. So that's how powerful and important punctuation is.